everyone. I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One on One. New York Times best-selling author Wiley Cash has just released his fourth novel. It's called When Ghosts Come Home. And while it may be the fourth novel of his writing career, it represents several firsts for the North Carolina native. It's the first of his books to take place along the coast, close to his family's home here in Wilmington. It's also the first murder mystery that Wiley Cash has written. He set the book in the mid-1980s. So those of you who are around my age, you're going to enjoy the many references that date back to that time. And while the time frame may be different, the characters face many of the same social issues that are making headlines even today. New York Times best-selling author, college instructor, and part-time stand-up comedian, Wiley Cash, welcome to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
The new book, congratulations, When Ghosts Come Home, your fourth. It is a great read. I went through it in 2 days. It's an easy read, but it's a read that made me think all the way through. What does that tell you when somebody gives you their feeling on your book, and it may be different from somebody else and may be different from somebody else?
Well, I like that you said it's an easy read that made you think all the way through. You know, for this novel, I really wanted to write a fast-paced novel that felt very plot-driven, and that the reader was going to read it as quickly as possible to see what would happen next. I'm glad that it made you think, because I also wanted to create really resonant, well-defined, deeply evocative characters that feel like real people, that provide the reader maybe some little speed bumps in the story that makes them ask, I don't know if I would do that, or I don't think that's a good idea, or that concerns me. And so I wanted it to feel fast, but I also wanted it to leave an impression on readers who have come to care about these characters.
Well, I'm going to try not to give it away here, but as I read it, I realized I was getting to the point where there weren't a lot of pages left.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, okay, how's he going to take this? How's he going to take this? And then one person asked another person a question, the other person agreed, and then oh no. Is that what's going to happen? And then 3 or 4 pages later, it happened. You know, I like being taken along on a story. And I like being, I don't know if lured is the right word, but I really liked the way you took everybody through, and then all of a sudden it turned on a dime, one question, and then all of a sudden there's your ending.
Yeah, and that ending kind of surprised me. I knew the emotional note that I wanted to end on, and I knew whose story this was going to end up being. And I think that readers will be surprised by who the story ends up belonging to on the last page. Yeah. But that turn there did surprise me. And, you know, we have a particular character who makes a lot of good, a lot of noble, a lot of selfless decisions throughout the novel. And in that one moment, this character makes a decision that may be driven a little bit by pride. It might be driven a little bit by satisfaction, a little bit by ego, and it's a fateful decision. And when I reached that point in not only the plot, but the characterization, I was surprised as you, John, and I thought, this is the only way this book can end.
Yeah, and it was fun. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, I really think it was a fun way to take the plot, because again, he all of a sudden, he got energized. Yeah, I want to do that. Yeah. And then it was, next thing you know, it turned the plot. I've had a chance this year, Wiley, to interview several best-selling authors. And they write different ways. Jack Carr, the former Navy SEAL, thriller writer, told me that he lays everything out on an outline before he goes into a book. Brad Thor, another thriller writer, been around for decades, says he sits down and the story just kind of comes out. He doesn't plot anything out. What about you? What kind of writer are you? Do you have an idea where you want to go? Or as you're typing, you're like, oh, that's a good idea. Let me weave this in.
Well, I don't really have an idea of where I want the plot to go. And I kind of try to come up with characters who feel interesting, who feel relevant, who feel kind of mysterious to me as well. Because I'm going to be spending a lot of time with these people, and I want them to feel mysterious to me. And so I really try to create characters that I know I can spend some considerable time with, you know, the years and months it takes to write a novel like the ones that I write. But I also, you know, I don't type. I hand wrote this novel. I hand wrote When Ghosts Come Home, and it really allowed me to slow down because I can type just fast enough where I can get ahead of my thoughts. And when you're a writer and you're looking at that blank page or that blinking cursor, that's death. You think, oh my gosh, I don't have the words to fill that in. But when I'm handwriting, I can think faster than I can handwrite. So my hand is constantly trying to catch up with my brain. And that's a wonderful place for a writer to be, where you feel panicked. You know, you're like, how am I going to get all this stuff down? That's a great way to work and to spend your days working. And so with this book, I never ran out of words. I never ran out of characterization. I never ran out of scenarios to really put on the page. And so it was easier for me, as Brad Thor mentioned, or as you mentioned, as he does, to kind of feel my way through the book in a way that felt very organic to me.
To me, to hear you say you handwrite in our time of technology, where, let's face it, penmanship is really not a high priority right now, to hear you write just fascinates me.
Well, if it makes you, if it continues to fascinate, I also have a flip phone. So I go as low tech as possible. I mean, granted, I'm joining you here on my laptop, on my MacBook Air, via Zoom, but you know, those kind of more dated ways of working and communicating you know, my life is very loud. It's very busy. I work all the time. I travel, I teach, I write. I've got 2 young children. I'm married. My wife has an active career as a photographer. So we got a lot going on. So as quiet as I can get my life to be while still maintaining the energy of it, I take every chance I can get.
Well, then I can see a little bit then why you went back to the 80s. Then because you took several decades back with the technology. And thank you, by the way, for taking me back to my senior year in college in 1984 and 85. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And I appreciate the references to everything that I had in my college dorm, the telephone book, the reference to Datsun, the beanbag chair. Why the 80s? Wiley, why did you go back to the 80s for this? And I'm going to ask you why you went back to Oak Island, but let's go time period first.
Well, a couple of reasons. The 80s were really the first time in 1984 I was 7 during the election of Ronald Reagan. And that felt like a watershed moment in American history for me, because at that time it was easy to assume, especially if you looked around where I was raised in Gastonia, North Carolina, it was easy to assume that we were a unified nation. You know, Ronald Reagan was telling us it's morning in America. We're a city on a hill. He wins 60% of the popular vote, 49 states, except for Walter Mondale's Minnesota. And so it felt like we were a nation charging forward with great promise and hope and possibility. But in reality, we are in the early days of the AIDS crisis. We are suffering the crack epidemic. We are dealing with the bottoming out of rural Rust Belt, Southern Appalachian economies. And it's a moment where you can look back and you can listen to a song like Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, and you can be proud, yeah, I'm born in the USA, without listening to the lyrics where Bruce Springsteen sings, I was born down in a dead man's town, and the first hit I took is when I hit the ground. And so as an adult looking back on 1984, I can look past the city on the hill. I can look past Morning in America, look at AIDS, look at drugs, look at the bottoming out of the economy, and I can see the complications of that era. And so I wanted to write a book about that time that revealed those complications in race, class, gender, the rural and urban divide, and really explore those issues that I didn't know to explore in 1984.
Yeah, and as I hear you talk, I was 21, 22 years old back then. I was getting into TV, so I was into my TV career. I did sports back then. So I was paying attention to what was going on in sports. I was learning video and audio. I knew Reagan was president, and I knew these things were happening, but it really didn't impact me to the point now where I look at it and say, oh yeah, look at Bruce's lyrics. It's different than standing up and saying "Born in the USA."
Sure, yeah, yeah.
And so it made me, I mean, just in the last 2 minutes, it's made me look back at my life and say, okay, I probably, had I been more of an adult then, I might have seen things differently.
Yeah, and I think that there were people, you know, older than you, and at that time, especially musicians. You know, we look at the rise of so much great music, and music and art really comes from moments in our history where there is a struggle, where there is an uncertainty, where there is an unstable space. And of course, we see disco, which is all about excess, which is all about hope, and all about, you know, at least, you know, disco popularly and traditionally. I'm thinking about, you know, Saturday Night Fever, and Studio 54 and Excess and the Me Generation, but it's giving away to some really complicated pop music like REM, for example, some really politically aware pop music. It's also giving away to like really culturally, socially conscious hip hop music. And so 1984 really marks a watershed moment for us in many ways as a country.
Why in Oak Island? I know you have a personal background in Oak Island with your folks down there, but first time you're setting one of your novels in this part of the state. I got here in 1992, and South College Road wasn't even 4-lane to Monkey Junction when I got here.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what the first time I went down to Oak Island, but to hear you describe it, I think that's what I remember it being, a small town where a person can go to get lost if they want to.
Sure, yeah. And, you know, my parents moved down to Oak Island. I grew up in Gastonia, and my parents moved down to Oak Island in 1998. And even then, Oak Island was a pretty sleepy hamlet. I mean, it went pretty dark, even in the summertime at about 6 o'clock. And Lord knows the off season after Labor Day, it was really slow paced, really quiet, really sleepy. And so setting the novel there in 1984 gave it kind of this claustrophobic, tunneling weather to the novel. And I also heard a story from someone, and I actually never looked into this story, that there was an instance of an aircraft that was too large for the runway landing at the Oak Island Regional Jetport, which it is now called, but back in the 80s and late 70s, it was actually a turf runway. And that this enormous aircraft landed, and they had to hire a stunt pilot to come and fly it off of the runway. And I never looked into that story. I didn't care whether it was true or not. I just love that idea for a setup for a novel, that a large aircraft lands at a rural runway and they have to figure out how to get it off the runway. And then, of course, I complicated things by having a dead body alongside the aircraft in the middle of the night.
Why a murder mystery? Did you want to challenge yourself? Or is this something you always wanted to do? Or did you want to say, okay, Wiley, let's try this?
Well, you know, I had never necessarily wanted to write a murder mystery, but you know, books kind of have a strange way of revealing themselves to you once you get into them, and you find ways to complicate the plot. You know, having a large aircraft land on a rural runway is a great way to start a story. That's kind of a hook that might get someone to the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth page. But how do you keep them there? And having a dead body is a good way to keep people on the page, keep them tuned into the page. Mm-hmm. But then also having the death of that man be someone who's beloved in the community, be someone whose father is, a historical, cultural voice in the community.
Right.
And that was a way to kind of keep the reader engaged beyond that initial mystery of the appearance of this aircraft. And granted, that is a mystery that is solved by the end of the book, as is the mystery of the man who's dead alongside the runway. But you got to bring those human stakes to a story to really keep somebody engaged with the page.
When we talk about ghosts, let's give one clue to the folks who are listening or watching. When we talk about ghosts, we're not talking about Casper here. We're talking about deeper kind of ghost issues. And the thing that I found interesting about this is that you have several characters who have the ghosts that they're dealing with. It's not just one main character and one main thing that they're thinking about. You've got Winston, you've got Colleen, you've got Jay. They all have their own ghosts. And I think it's interesting to me the way you weaved them. They all come in contact with each other, but they all still have to deal with their own ghosts in their own ways.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's a great reading of what I was trying to do, John. There are three main characters. Winston is a 63-year-old sheriff who's facing a tough re-election battle. He's up for re-election in just a couple of days when this aircraft and this dead body suddenly appear in Oak Island, and he's got to solve this mystery. And hopefully he will do it in enough time to win the trust of his constituents and be re-elected. He's got a tough challenger that he's facing. And his daughter, Colleen, is 25 years old. She appears home out of nowhere the day after this aircraft lands. She's fleeing a rocky young marriage in Texas. She has lost a child. She's suffering a heartbreak she can't even imagine. And then Jay is this Black teenager, 14 years old, who's from Atlanta, whose parents sent him up to Southport to be out in the country with his 25-year-old sister and her husband and their newborn baby, because Jay got into some trouble back in Atlanta, and his parents think that if he just falls under the tutelage of his perfect sister and her perfect husband and their perfect baby, then he'll be able to get it together and come back and finish high school down in Atlanta. Each of these three characters, Winston, Colleen, and Jay, are haunted by different things in their past. They are either decisions they've made, decisions they did not make, cultural implications, historical implications. They may or may not understand and their role in those things. So all of these characters are moving through the novel with pressure bearing down upon them. And they have to exercise those ghosts in one way or another in order to get through to the end of this book. And
I think also you have weaved in, again, I use the word weave because it is almost like a knit one, purl two. You know, you bring this in here, you bring this one, wrap it around, okay, take it this way, this one's going this way. But the thing I also liked is that I get the sense that you're wanting to discuss, not make a statement on, because I think that's a difference. You're wanting to discuss racial strife and white supremacy. You're wanting to discuss money in politics. You're wanting to discuss the perception of what the popular belief is versus the gut instinct of another individual. Is that, am I on the beat here?
I think, yeah, you absolutely are. And there are a lot of issues that are brought up in the novel. You know, as you mentioned, white supremacy, race relations, historical reckoning, gender roles, especially in the 1980s, campaign politics, environmentalism with development. And, you know, novels like the ones that I write, I have my very sincerely held political, cultural, historical beliefs that shouldn't be too hard for people to find if they want to do any digging around on me. But in my novels, I don't want to write novels that have easy answers. You know, my last novel was about a mill strike in my hometown in 1929. And it is a labor novel, but it's not a pro-union novel. It's not an anti-capitalism novel. And because providing those easy answers in a 400-page novel, or maybe my new novel's only 285 pages maybe, to think that I can answer successfully the legacy of racism in the Deep South in that few pages is preposterous. But I would like to present it to you and show you how it perhaps affects people's lives and just ask you to think about it. Right. But I appreciate that, John. I really enjoy introducing these issues, and I feel a burden's the wrong word, but I would feel like it would be a lost opportunity given my small megaphone that I've got and my native allegiance to the American South to not introduce these issues. But I think I would be assuming a lot of myself that I could solve them or even present solutions in a short amount of pages.
But I think it's to be saluted that you're bringing them up for discussion. Now, a discussion in the realm of the 285 pages and the characters you've created here. But if someone can think about what it means to have a Confederate flag driven through your house in the middle of the night, or can think about what it's like to be a guy who's trying to do the best he can as a sheriff and trying to solve it, and then having somebody else come in with mega amounts of money and trying to do whatever he wants to do to the environment. To see the impact and at least have the discussions, I think you should be saluted for, because it's, number one, they're not easy discussions, but number two, they need to be had.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. And, that is kind of the role of, I think, realist fiction, is to bring a dose of reality, however uncomfortable it may be. And, I write novels about the world as it is, not the world that I want it to be. And so sometimes my novels can be a little bit dark. I think that there are flashes of humor in them. I think there are some pretty funny moments in this novel. But this is the world that is. It's not the world that I want it to be. But I think in presenting the world as it is, there's value in confronting the reality of where we find ourselves in 2021 or 1984 or whenever we're alive.
Yeah, well, when Winston puts on the Walkman and starts doing the whole thing with his arm, and you get Colleen to give the eye roll, I could just see my daughters in the back seat as I was doing the same thing when they were kids. So the humor is definitely there.
Well, I'm a dad too, and my girls are just 7 and 5, but they roll their eyes at me plenty. Let me tell you, it is an epidemic of dads.
Yeah. I emailed you about this, and because I've told you this in the past, I love good writing. I write in snippets. I write news stories. I write longer stories, but I write every day, and I love good writing. And I emailed you about this because this is one of the best lines that I have ever seen put down on a printed piece of paper. And I'm going to let everybody else listen to this. The night before, he'd gone to sleep with worry strapped to him like a dynamite vest. Each of the worries packaged like a tiny bomb that he either had to snuff out or face the possibility of it blowing a hole in his heart. My word, do you remember when that came to you? Because that to me is as descriptive and emotional a line as I have ever read.
I don't know when I came up with that. I can remember working on that scene. That's one of the scenes that opens the novel. And, the novel opens when Winston, our sheriff, is in bed with his wife, Marie. It's the middle of the night, and they are awakened by the sound of this aircraft flying low over their house, over the island, going across the waterway and heading for the airport. And he gets out of bed and he drives out to the airport, and he's thinking about his life on that drive. I mean, he assumes this is going to be a relatively routine investigation. It's just an aircraft that needed some help, or maybe it's crashed, or, whatever the case may be. He doesn't think what he's going to find out at the airport is going to change his life forever, in the life of his family, in the life of his town. And so he's just thinking about himself. He's thinking about his daughter. He's thinking about his wife's illness. He's thinking about his own father. He's thinking about the role of fathers and daughters, and his relationship with his own father. And he's thinking about all the worries that he goes to bed with every night. I said packets of dynamite because they may not be huge crushing worries like, an existential crisis, but it may be a worry about, making the mortgage, a worry about your child's marriage to their spouse, a worry about a work issue. But all these worries come to bear on us in ways that can really fester and dominate our quiet moments. And Winston is one of those characters. Whenever he has a chance to be quiet, he worries. He worries about everything in his life, really, except himself.
Well, in a world where when we see those kind of vests, it's usually the bad guy putting it on one of the hostages when they want to get out of the bank. Or you think about a suicide bomber somewhere. Sure. To use that connotation, though, in this instance, again, I wrote to you how great a line that was. I applaud you for using it in the emotional sense, when many people, when they think of dynamite vest, don't think of anything other than destruction.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. And in many ways, Winston has slipped that vest on himself. And by the end of the book, he has very much done that to himself, because, Winston is a guy who wants to make the right decision. He wants to make the ethical decision, but oftentimes he also wants to make the expedient decision. He wants to make the easy decision. And, you know, our contemporary political moment, cultural moment asks for hard decisions. And 1984 asked for some hard decisions. And oftentimes we just want to say no to things wholesale or yes to things wholesale. And it's a little more complicated than that. And I think especially being a Southerner, that's what we're asked to make those tough decisions on a daily basis in terms of our culture, our history, our regional attitudes as well.
You're married, you have two daughters, so you have females in your life, but you're not a 25-year-old who has lost a child. You have never had that first step into womanhood like Colleen has. You are so descriptive with these two instances that I bring up. When she's flying back and she sees her son, and when she experiences her first period on a special day. How do you write so well from a woman's point of view? Do you ask your wife? Do you listen when people are talking? Is that just Wiley being Wiley?
I think that, you know, we'll first start with the story of Colleen getting her period when I can't quite remember. I think she's in 8th grade. She gets it her 7th grade, and it's picture day, and she's not ready for it. And it ruins the outfit that she saved up money for and bought for picture day. I've just heard so many stories like that. You know, those kinds of stories are kind of baked into the consciousness of the human experience because I've heard those stories, I've read those stories. Okay. But I also know what it means to be greatly disappointed. I know what it means to save your money for something that you really hold dear and cherish, and to have that thing break or malfunction or be ruined or be lost. I know what that feels like. And I might not be a young woman who experienced that, but I was a young man who experienced that. And I had two loving parents who were always there for me and trying to pick up the pieces of whatever mess, you know, fate had made of my life or I had made of it myself. And I know what it's like to have a parent come to your rescue. And I want to believe that I am the kind of parent who will come to my children's rescue as well. And so it wasn't too hard for me to imagine being in the emotional space that either Colleen or her father were in when he saves the day in that instance. As far as losing a child, you know, I've been very fortunate that I haven't suffered that tragedy. But I've imagined that tragedy, and I imagine it as being the worst possible thing that can happen to someone. I've had close friends that has happened to, and I think that for me, in some ways, writing about the worst thing that can happen is to me in some ways a balm against it happening, and just kind of putting myself in that mindset there. And so when Colleen sees her child, she's fleeing this tragedy that she and her husband experienced in Dallas, and she flies home to Oak Island because she wants to go back to her childhood bedroom to try to make sense of her life. And while she is flying in the aircraft, she's had a couple of beers, which she does quite often throughout the book, and she imagines seeing the spirit of her child flying outside the window, trying not to be left behind in Dallas. He's following after her. And I just thought about how deeply emotional and deeply resonant that moment would feel to me if I were to imagine something like that.
Speaking of emotion, what is the emotion when you put that period at the end of the last sentence? Or in your first 3 books, when you've hit that period key on your computer and your book is done? What's that emotion like? Is it relief? Is it, okay, now I'm getting ready to send it out to the world?
It's changed with each one. You know, with my first novel, Land More Kind Than Home, when I did that, I was living in West Virginia by myself. I was engaged. Mallory was finishing up law school at the University of South Carolina. She was about to move up. We were going to get married. We got married right here in Wilmington, actually, in 2010. But when I finished that novel, the first good draft of that novel, I was by myself and ended up going out to dinner with some friends in Pittsburgh who taught at the little college where I taught. It was a very insular experience because I had just met some of these people. They didn't know how long I'd been working on this book. They didn't quite understand what it meant to have written and finished a novel. So that was a very private thing. And then with this most recent novel, When Ghosts Come Home, finishing it, I'm married. I have 2 kids. I've got a career behind me, hopefully ahead of me. And it's a much more public thing. I'm sending it off to an editor. I'm going back home to my family. I have this enormous weight off of my back. And and the shackle from off of my leg in many ways. And so it began as a very private celebration, and then it ends up being a very family-oriented celebration.
But is it the world off your shoulders? Or
It
now,
is.
because you have to go to an editor, is it, okay, I want to see what they do with this now?
I have a great relationship with my editor. We have a lot of fun together. I'm really fortunate. He's from Raleigh. He's a Raleigh native. And so we see the world and see the experience of writing and reading, especially Southern literature, in much the same way. So I have a blast kicking the manuscript back and forth with him. So that's never a worry. But one thing I can assure you is a couple of things, is that, for a long time, writing was my hobby, and it was this secret private thing that I nurtured. Well, once your hobby becomes your career, it is very much your career. And then also being a writer, I'll quote my friend Kevin Maurer, who I'm sure you know, John.
Oh, yes.
Lives right here in the Cape Fear
I
region.
enjoy Kevin. I think he's a great writer and a great young man, too.
He is. But he says being a writer means you always have homework. And that's true. I always have homework. Even if I don't have a book under contract, I'm always working on an essay. I'm always writing a recommendation letter for a student. I always have to do some kind of work, and it's always hanging over my head. Once upon a time, that was a hobby. But now there are expectations and there are deadlines and there are sometimes incentives, whether they be financial or ethical or professional. So it's amazing how the craft becomes professionalized pretty quickly.
Well, when you look at Wiley Cash, I mean, if you look at Wiley Cash on a piece of paper, he's got a PhD, he teaches, he's got an MA, and he writes. But your books have been 2012, 2014, 2017, 2021. A lot of authors, boom, every year they come back with it. Mm-hmm. So as you look at Wiley Cash, you're like, well, he just dabbles in writing and he teaches on the side. Are you happy with the way things are now? You turn out books every once in a while, you still teach, you're able to be dad at home with your daughters. Yeah. Is it a content time now for Wiley, or would you like to write more often?
I don't know. Writing it takes a lot out of me. My last novel, The Last Ballad, took a lot out of me. That novel was the hardest novel I've written in terms of its research, its scope, its emotional toll, the way I tried to cover the state of North Carolina in those pages. But I do a lot of things to keep writing. I'm not John Grisham or J.K. Rowling or Stephen King in terms of sales. And so I have to do a lot of hustling to keep the books coming. And so I teach, I do speaking engagements, I travel a lot to universities and libraries and community groups. And so my writing is almost a byproduct of the success I've had as a writer. And granted, I teach full time because I've been a successful writer. I'm invited to speak a lot because I'm a successful writer. But in order to be a successful writer, I have to do all of those things. And so, would I like to write more and write more books? Absolutely. But it's also come to me in a way that these are the ideas I've had, the 4 ideas I've had for novels. I've written all of them and they've published. And not everyone can say that. So I feel really fortunate in those terms. But I also really enjoy teaching. I teach at UNC Asheville. I'm the alumni author in residence there. I teach 1 or 2 classes a year, and it's incredible. My students are brilliant. They're hungry. They're curious. My colleagues are fantastic. And so I feel really fortunate to be doing that as well. And I get to be home for the most part quite often with my girls. I dropped them off at school this morning. I'm going to go pick them up at 2:45. I feel really lucky. I feel almost too lucky sometimes.
Do you, as an instructor, get a kick when your students get it, when that light bulb goes off, and when that concept all of a sudden they recognize and they go from wanting to do something to being able to do something?
Yeah, I get excited, and it's different in the creative writing classroom as opposed to the literature classroom. Right now, I'm teaching a creative writing class on Monday nights. I spend Monday night in Asheville in the fall, and then on Tuesday morning, I teach a literature class. And the literature class I get excited about when I see students making connections. UNC Asheville is a public liberal arts college. They take the the liberal arts very seriously, humanities-based education. And so when I have students making connections between the first text we've read that semester, now we're on our fifth novel, we're about to read this wonderful book, Leave the World Behind. When I see them making those connections between texts, between what they're studying in other classes, between historical moments or eras or literary or cultural movements, it is exhilarating. It is absolutely exhilarating to see those connections made, because that's the test of knowledge. That's when you really know something, when you're bridging gaps between years or decades or centuries. In the creative writing classroom, I get really excited when I read the first story from a student who clearly has something to say, right? There's an urgency to the writing. There is an angle to the perspective. There is an invocation of landscape or region. I get really excited when I encounter that, because I know if a student's got something, I can help them get more. And there are a lot of students like that at UNC Asheville who's already got something. And I find a real thrill in helping them get more.
Well, I have listened to many of your talks, listened to many interviews, read many interviews you've done. I think if you were my creative writing teacher in college, I might not be doing what I'm doing now. I may have gravitated toward that because, and I say this with all sincerity, is that every time I hear or read an interview with you, I come away feeling like I'm smarter.
Oh, well, that's nice. Well, I can tell you that you probably have had a much more stable career, and your family is probably thankful that you've chosen the route that you did. But I appreciate that, John. I enjoy very much teaching. I enjoy being in the classroom. I enjoy working with students, and I enjoy discussing ideas, because there's so much mystery involved in creativity and how to get what is in your mind onto the page. It's a strange transmogrification that almost feels spiritual. And so I tell my students, especially in the creative writing classroom, I say, this is going to be like church. You go to church to pick apart the mysteries of faith and apply them to your own life in a way to understand your life better. And we're going to do that in this class. We're going to pick apart the mysteries of why stories do and do not work. And we're going to ask hard questions about who our characters are, about what their stories are, about how we can borrow from our own lives and see them in a way that has value on the page. And so I really enjoy discussing ideas, and I really appreciate you saying those kind words.
What do you get from your relationship with your brother? And is stand-up comedy kind of an outlet for you? Because and we said this when you were with me when Cliff was on. I don't think people realize how tough it is and the work that goes into delivering jokes and coming up with jokes and the timing and everything else like that. But do you get something special, not just because he's your brother, but I sense that it's an outlet for you. True?
Yeah, when Cliff started doing comedy, I wasn't surprised, because he's always been very funny. He's always been, especially situationally, very funny. And he's off the cuff funny, and he has a great memory and a great understanding of situations. He can read situations pretty well. And I feel like I can too. I don't have his memory in terms of people and names, and I mean his recall and stuff like that is phenomenal. I was a little surprised when he was successful as quickly as he was, in terms of getting down a really tight set of jokes, because joke writing, and I only realized this after watching him, joke writing is all about structure. It's all about timing. It's all about memorizing where the levers and the pulleys and the trampolines are. And it's not storytelling. Storytelling is contemporaneous and expository, and you just kind of go and you find the narrative and you just go. Telling jokes is all about knowing where all the parts of the thing are. And Cliff's ability to not only construct that apparatus, but also deliver on it routinely in ways that feel fresh and urgent is pretty magnificent. And I've done a little comedy with him. I've never, done an open mic without him or anything like that. But, I've hosted shows that he's done here in Wilmington. We did a show together in Asheville.
Right.
And I flounder a little bit when I have jokes because I can't remember like he can where all those tricks are, where all the pulleys are, and they come across as very staged and very mechanical, whereas his are very natural and flowing and resonant. I think my strength as a stage presence is much more in storytelling, where I can jump around and circle back, and which is also kind of a particularly Southern way to tell stories, kind of this circular narrative where we're spinning forward and we're not, moving on a straight line forward. But comedy is fun. It's the scaredest I've ever been to get on stage. I've spoken in front of literally thousands of people before without having any idea what I was going to say, and I've not been one bit nervous. Comedy in front of a room of 100 people, I'm terrified. Absolutely terrified every time. And he's like, eating a hamburger 2 seconds before he goes on stage, wiping his mouth as they're calling his name, because he just knows. He's just got that kind of animal instinct about how to get up there and deliver a tight set of jokes in a way that feels incredibly organic and off the cuff.
But I also think, and I'll ask you if you agree, that we all need that time away from what it is that we do, in order to make sure that what it is we do is fresh when we come back to it. For me, it's something as simple as cutting the grass. I go out, I leave everything away, or everything back, away from where I am, and that's my task, and that's what I do for 10 or 15 minutes, and I concentrate on that, and there's nothing else. Yeah. And I think something as simple as that for me gets me away from, all right, I know the Senate has a vote today, and I know who New Hanover County Commissioners meet tonight, and we may have to go live from there. I need to put that away so that when it is time, I can approach it from a fresh vantage point.
Yeah. I think that the other things that I have in my life, reading is one of those for me, but I'm not really getting away from words. And when I read, I'm still trying to figure out how this book works. How is it manipulating me, and what can I borrow from this? Doing comedy with Cliff is a little bit of that for me, but at the same time, I'm very much a workaholic. I don't think of it consciously. My wife will tell you that, but that's kind of our family's blue collar background ethic. Our dad was that way. When he wasn't at work, he was doing handyman stuff around the house, working in the yard, working on cars. Our mom is very much that way. My sister, we have an older sister who lives up in the mountains in Burnsville. She is very much that way. Cliff is very much that way. And if I weren't writing, I would just be doing something else that takes a lot of my time. And a couple of years ago, I was at the doctor, and my doctor said, "Now, what are your hobbies?" And I said, I don't really have any. I mean, I wish I did, and I need to develop some, and I'm still working on that. I've got friends who are writers. I mentioned Kevin. Kevin's very much the same way. Kevin is a workaholic. God bless him. He is a workaholic. But Clyde Edgerton, who I'm sure you know, John, I mean, Clyde writes, he teaches, but he also paints, and he's a musician, and he's got his pilot's license, and he's got all these other things going on for him.
And very active in politics recently,
Very active in politics. He's literally doing so many things all of the time, and I have a lot of admiration for him as a person, and him as an artist and a hobbyist as well.
What about the girls? Do they know Dad's a writer?
They do. They don't. It's interesting, they know that I dedicated The Last Ballad, my last novel, to them, and they get a kick out of that if we're in a bookstore and they pull it off the shelf and find their names. One of our 7-year-old's classmates asked her about my new book, and she came home and was kind of excited about that. But they don't find anything very special about it. When I started teaching at UNCA, our oldest daughter said, "Daddy, you're not a teacher, you're just a writer." Because they don't ever really see me writing. They can't, and say I come to this office where I am right now, and I don't write at home in front of them. There's some books on the shelf that have my pictures on them, but they don't really know what goes into that so much. They're getting older. My 7-year-old said recently, "Daddy, don't get rid of any of your books, because as soon as I'm old enough to read them, I want to read them." And I have been thinking lately, what are my daughters going to know of me when they read these books? What are they going to know of my life and of their lives when they read them? Because two of the books that I've got have been written while they've been on this world. So I'm curious to know years down the road what they'll think about what I do.
How important is Mallory? I know she's from here. You moved back here to settle your family down, but I told people, and I will continue to tell people until I take my last breath, if it wasn't for my wife Sheila being the saint that she is, allowing me to work as often as I worked, to build this career, because I've always felt like I had to work harder than anybody else. I wasn't as good of a writer as this person. I wasn't as good as a reporter of this person. So I always felt I had to work harder. And without Sheila there, I wouldn't be anywhere near as successful as people think I am. What about Mallory? How important is she to the person that Wiley Cash is in 2021?
I mean, she's, everything. And it sounds, kind of cliche to say that. But, when I got my first book contract, I was teaching at a little college up in West Virginia, and Mallory was practicing law. And I told her, I said, I really want to resign from my teaching job because I think I can make a go of this. And this book contract, I had a 2-book contract. I said, it kind of makes me think that I can do this as a career. And she said, look, it's always been your dream to write novels. It's never been your dream to teach 8 classes a year and do committee work out the year for a small liberal arts college. So you need to resign and really go for this because I can support us if it doesn't work out. And she did, and it worked out, and she supported us, and she practiced law while I finished my first book and wrote my second. And her job is what brought us back to North Carolina. She had a legal job here in the region when we first moved back in 2013. And then once we started having children and I got the job at UNC Asheville, there for a while, we would live in Asheville for half the year, and it was not possible for her to work. And so she was with our girls. And I have this myth in my mind. It's a personal myth that we co-parent equally, and we do not. We do not co-parent. We do when I'm in town, and when I'm not in Asheville 2 days a week in the fall, we co-parent. But I'm gone a lot, and I work a lot. And she really takes the lead on, paying the bills, setting up the girls' stuff. And then she also manages a career in photography. She's had work published all over the place, Garden and Gun, the New York Times, Oxford American Magazine, local publications. And so she's found a way, despite me, to forge a successful career and as an artist and a very successful life as a mother as well. And, I'm only doing one thing and she's doing a whole bunch of things. And so there's no doubt that she sustains whatever crazy thing I'm trying to do next.
Yeah, and it's fun to grow old with somebody. We're married 36 years now, and it's fun to grow old with somebody that you're on the same page all the time. Mm-hmm. You're not catching up. You're right there every day on the same page. What's next for Wiley? What are you working on now, and what are you looking at for your next project?
Well, I got another book under contract set right here in the Cape Fear region. It's set in 2018 in the days after Silent Sam is toppled on this campus of UNC Chapel Hill. So that is what I am working on now.
Well, again, the new book, When Ghosts Come Home, it is an awesome read. Congratulations. Again,
thank you, John.
It's a fine project.
I appreciate this so much.
And it's a well worth investing time in because you'll travel to places without even leaving your chair. Wiley Cash, thanks again, and all the best to you, my friend.
Thank you, John.
A huge thank you to Wiley Cash for taking the time out of a busy schedule to join us for this week's podcast interview. If you want to learn more about the new novel, When Ghosts Come Home, or about everything in Wiley's career, just go to wileycash.com. And you heard him mention his wife Mallory and her successful photography work. If you want to learn more about Mallory's work, just go to mallorycashphoto.com. Now, before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please download and subscribe to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast on whatever app you use to listen to your favorite shows. And if you would be so kind, please leave us a rating or a review. We really do care what you think about our interviews. And the more feedback we have from friends like you, the higher we'll be listed on the apps, the better chance we'll have of bringing in even more new listeners. I'm John Evans. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of One on One.